In episode 87, titled Credential Reuse and Expansion, the central lesson is that credentials are often the lever that turns a small, local foothold into broad organizational reach. A single username and password, token, or service secret can act like a master key when it works in more than one place. And that is why credential handling remains one of the most practical security problems to understand. In real environments, access is rarely expanded by a single dramatic exploit, but rather by chaining together small authentication wins that accumulate into meaningful capability. This is also why credential-centric attacks feel quiet, because a valid login can look like normal activity unless you are watching for unusual patterns. The goal in this episode is to understand how reuse happens, how expansion is measured, and how to validate impact responsibly without creating additional risk. Credential reuse is simple to define. The same credential works across multiple systems or services. That reuse can be intentional, such as a shared administrator password used for convenience across many hosts, or accidental, such as a user reusing a password across multiple internal portals. It can also occur through synchronized identity systems, where a password change is expected to propagate but does not, leaving old values valid longer than planned. Reuse is powerful because it collapses what should be separate authentication boundaries into one, so compromise of one boundary effectively compromises several. The risk increases with each additional place the credential works because the attacker can pivot by authenticating normally rather than needing to exploit a new vulnerability. When you recognize reuse, you are really recognizing that the organization has fewer distinct security compartments than it believes. Expansion is what the attacker does with reuse, and the goal is to find where those credentials provide higher privilege or wider access than the initial context. Sometimes, expansion means moving from a workstation to a server because servers often host centralized data, shared services, or management interfaces. Other times, it means moving from a low-sensitivity application to a high-sensitivity repository because the same account is trusted too broadly. Expansion can also mean privilege escalation by discovery, where the credential is not privileged everywhere, but it is privileged somewhere, and somewhere is enough. The key is to think in terms of access pathways, not just roles, because a credential might be non-admin but still grant access to critical data stores or automation interfaces. In an assessment mindset, expansion is measured by what new actions become possible and what new assets become reachable. To expand responsibly, you first need to understand where credentials are likely to come from, and many environments have predictable sources. Password stores can be official, such as enterprise password vaults, or informal, such as notes, spreadsheets, configuration files, or scripts left behind for convenience. Shared admin accounts are another frequent source because teams use them for operational efficiency, but shared access often leads to shared secrets and weak accountability. Service credentials are especially important because they are designed to run unattended, so they are often long-lived and rarely changed, making them attractive targets. You also see credentials embedded in automation tooling, scheduled jobs, deployment pipelines, and integration configurations where secrets are required to connect systems. The broader point is that credentials appear where systems need to talk to other systems, and those trust links become the attack surface. Lateral movement often begins with credential discovery and validation, because credentials are the cleanest way to move without triggering exploit-focused defenses. If an attacker can authenticate normally, they can often leverage built-in access pathways that were never designed to be hacked, only to be used. That makes credential validation a practical early step because it answers a simple question: where does this key fit? Once an attacker finds that a credential works on a new system, the new system becomes a staging point for additional discovery, additional credential exposure, and potentially access to broader network segments. This is also why defenders emphasize controlling credential sprawl, because sprawl turns every endpoint into a potential gateway. For pen test plus reasoning, it is important to connect the dots. Credential discovery enables validation. Validation enables lateral movement, and lateral movement accelerates further discovery. Safe boundaries are critical when you evaluate credential reuse because the very act of testing can create operational and security risk if it is done carelessly. You should only test authorized targets, and authorization should be explicit enough that you can explain why each validation step was permitted. You also want to avoid spreading secrets, which means treating discovered credentials as sensitive evidence and limiting where they are recorded, displayed, or shared. Uncontrolled testing can trigger account lockouts, create noisy authentication logs, and disrupt services, especially when credentials belong to shared accounts or service identities. A disciplined approach favors minimal, controlled validation that confirms reuse without turning the environment into a brute force environment. This is the professional posture the exam expects. Prove what you need to prove and stop before you create collateral impact. Now, consider a scenario where one credential works on both a file share and a server, even though the initial access was limited. Perhaps you obtained a standard user credential in one context, and you test it against an authorized file share and find you can read folders that appear sensitive or operationally important. Then you validate the same credential against a server login surface that is in scope and discover that it authenticates successfully there as well. In this situation, you have a concrete example of reuse because the credential crosses system boundaries, and you have an expansion opportunity because the server context may grant additional visibility, tools, or access to internal services. The significance is not just that the login works, but that the trust model is broader than expected, and that breadth creates new paths for an attacker. The scenario illustrates why reuse is an accelerant. It reduces the number of distinct barriers an attacker must overcome. The next decision after discovering reuse is where disciplined testers slow down and choose the path that yields the most meaningful proof with the least risk. You validate scope by determining how many systems the credential works on, but you do this cautiously, focusing on high-value, authorized targets rather than spraying authentication attempts broadly. You prioritize high-value access by identifying which reachable systems or shares represent crown jewel exposure, such as sensitive data, administrative functions, or identity infrastructure. You also document carefully, because evidence needs to show where reuse occurred and what it enabled, without collecting unnecessary data or creating the impression of reckless access attempts. The decision is not simply try it everywhere, but prove the risk with controlled validation that supports remediation. That difference in mindset is what keeps credential testing responsible and defensible. Mitigation concepts for credential reuse are well understood, but they require discipline to execute. Unique passwords, strong authentication, and credential hygiene. Unique passwords break the master key problem by ensuring compromise of one context does not automatically unlock others. Strong authentication, including multi-factor approaches where appropriate, reduces the value of stolen passwords and makes simple reuse less effective for attackers. Credential hygiene is the broader practice of rotating secrets, minimizing where they are stored, eliminating embedded credentials in scripts and configurations, and managing service accounts as first-class security assets. These mitigations work best when combined with least privilege, because even a compromised credential should not grant broad access if permissions are properly scoped. The security goal is compartmentalization. Reduce how far any single credential can reach. Pitfalls are common in this area because credential reuse can tempt testers into assumptions and overly aggressive validation. One pitfall is assuming reuse without evidence, such as concluding that a password is shared across systems based on a single successful login that might instead be the result of centralized identity. Another pitfall is attempting broad logins recklessly, which can cause lockouts, trigger defensive actions, and create unnecessary disruption or suspicion. It is also easy to mishandle the credentials themselves, such as recording them in insecure notes or sharing them widely as part of collaboration, which turns the test into a new leakage event. A professional approach treats credentials as toxic assets, limits exposure, and validates reuse with minimal attempts that are clearly in scope. The exam-relevant takeaway is that sound methodology matters as much as technical knowledge. Quick wins often start with identifying shared accounts and enforcing least privilege separation because shared accounts are a structural driver of reuse. Shared accounts reduce accountability, complicate investigation, and encourage secret reuse because many people need access without friction. Enforcing separation means reducing where a credential can be used and ensuring that service accounts, admin accounts, and user accounts have distinct scopes and are not interchangeable. You also gain immediate value by tightening permission boundaries so that even if a credential works in multiple places, it does not grant broad access to sensitive resources. Another quick win is improving inventory, because you cannot control reuse you cannot see, and organizations often underestimate how many places a single secret is embedded. These steps are practical because they address the systemic causes of reuse rather than chasing symptoms one login at a time. Reporting language for credential reuse should be precise because stakeholders need to understand exactly where reuse occurred and what the validated impact is. Good reporting describes the credential scope in plain terms, such as which systems or services accepted the same authentication and what level of access was granted in each context. It explains impact by connecting reuse to plausible attack paths, such as reaching servers from a workstation foothold or accessing sensitive shares that should have been segmented. Recommended corrective actions should be concrete, including eliminating shared secrets, implementing unique passwords, tightening access scopes, and strengthening authentication for high-value systems. Reports should also avoid revealing the secret itself, because the goal is remediation, not distributing sensitive credentials. When the language is clear and bounded, it supports rapid action and reduces misinterpretation. A memory phrase helps keep your workflow disciplined. Find, verify, limit, prioritize, remediate. Find means locate candidate credentials or evidence of credential sprawl without assuming reuse is present. Verify means confirm where the credential actually works, using minimal, authorized validation steps rather than broad guessing. Limit means constrain testing to scope and reduce the spread of secrets, keeping operational and confidentiality risk low. Prioritize means focus on the highest value access paths that best demonstrate impact and guide remediation priorities. Remediate means translate findings into changes that reduce compartment collapse, including unique secrets, stronger authentication, and improved credential governance. As we conclude episode 87, the core reasoning is that credential reuse collapses boundaries, and expansion is the attacker's process of discovering where those collapsed boundaries lead. A responsible tester proves reuse with controlled validation, documents impact without overcollecting data, and stops when the conclusion is well supported. To rehearse safe validation steps once, you would first confirm the credential works in the original context. Then select a small set of explicitly authorized high-value targets for validation. Then record only the minimum evidence needed to show success and access level. And finally, halt further attempts once reuse is demonstrated and an actionable remediation path is clear. That rehearsal keeps you disciplined when the temptation to explore is high. When you approach credential reuse this way, you produce findings that are both powerful and professionally defensible. That balance is exactly what Pentest Plus expects and what real clients need. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.